21 years. That is it. That's the exact amount of time the world had to catch its breath. Just 21 short years between the absolute most devastating global conflict humanity had ever seen and an even more destructive one that followed right on its heels. The stakes during this unimaginably tense window, they were astronomical. The fate of the entire modern world wasn't actually decided on a battlefield in the 1940s. It was decided in the quiet, desperate, and unbelievably volatile 2 decades that came just before it.
But before continuing, we upload new history videos every day. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one.
So think about this. Did the end of World War I actually start World War II? It sounds totally counterintuitive, right? Because we're taught to think of history in these neat little boxes, where wars have clean start and end dates. But here is the shocking reality. The most massive global conflict in human history didn't just begin with a sudden gunshot out of nowhere in 1939. No, the spark was struck the exact moment the very first war ended. Literally, as soon as the ink dried on the peace agreements, the countdown clock began ticking, and the world was utterly blind to the mechanism they just set in motion.
We really have to stop looking at the years between 1918 and 1939 as an era of peace, or as just inevitable history where everyone was somehow helplessly floating toward a disaster. That wasn't the case at all. This 21-year period was the active, disastrous, and systematic construction of a global bomb. Piece by piece, policy by policy, the stage was deliberately being set for a catastrophe. It was a time when resentments were meticulously cultivated and old grudges were forged into brand new weapons.
Okay, let's dive into this and look at the root causes. Part 1. A peace built to fail. Let's see how the very attempts to enforce lasting peace actually guaranteed its destruction.
It all starts right here, with the Treaty of Versailles. This was the peace agreement intended to be the treaty that ended all wars, but it was completely marked by unresolved tensions. Think about it like this. Imagine you've just had a massive, destructive dispute with a neighbor. To settle it, you sit down and sign an agreement. But the terms are so uniquely punishing, forcing them to pay billions in crippling reparations, stripping away their property, and making them sign a war guilt clause, taking total blame for everything. That by signing it, you're essentially guaranteeing another, much worse fight is going to happen. That was Versailles. It didn't solve the core problems. It just humiliated a nation and paved a brightly lit road directly to future conflict.
And those unresolved tensions, they were violently amplified by pure economic devastation. Because when economies shatter, people panic. Global economic ruins stripped away stability entirely. Just to understand this desperation, look at the hyperinflation in Weimar Germany during the 1920s. Money became so utterly worthless that kids were literally playing with bricks of cash in the streets like toy blocks. Citizens needed wheelbarrows full of currency just to buy a single loaf of bread, and you had to rush to the baker before noon because the price would double by the afternoon. When your entire society is devastated like that, the hunger for a national resurgence becomes overpowering. People were hurting deeply, and they were willing to follow absolutely anyone who confidently promised them a way out of the abyss.
So economies collapsed, tensions rose, and then the arsonists arrived. Part 2. The Rise of the Dictators.
Now, what's really interesting here is how 3 separate totalitarian regimes expertly exploited that exact economic desperation. They launched a synchronized, multi-front global threat. First, Germany focused on rapid, illegal rearmament and aggressive territorial claims, marching troops right back into the demilitarized Rhineland, completely defying international law. Meanwhile, on the other side of the world, Japan initiated brutal conquests across Asia, invading Manchuria to violently seize the resources it needed. And then you had Italy, driven by aggressive imperial ambitions, launching a ruthless invasion of Ethiopia using modern weapons against fiercely outgunned defenders. These dictators were systematically testing the fences, pushing expansionist policies simultaneously across the globe to see exactly what they could get away with.
So, if all this violent aggression is happening in broad daylight, where was the alarm system, right? Let's transition to Part 3, the ineffective watchdogs.
The intended purpose of the newly formed League of Nations was brilliant on paper, maintain global peace and order through collective security. But the actual reality? Total ineffectiveness. The League of Nations was basically like a highly paid referee who proudly shows up to officiate the championship game of the century, but totally forgets to bring their whistle, or their penalty flags. They could watch the rule-breaking happen, they could write sternly worded letters condemning the invasions, but they were entirely powerless to physically stop any of it. Without an armed force to back up their rulings, the League was really nothing more than a debating society watching the world burn.
And it wasn't just the League of Nations that dropped the ball. The major global democracies, specifically Britain and France, failed drastically to halt the incoming conflict. Why? Well, they were weakened by their own immense economic woes from the Great Depression, but more importantly, the psychological trauma of World War I was still incredibly fresh. Millions of their young men had just died. So there was this massive, deep-seated reluctance to confront aggression. This led directly to appeasement. Instead of standing up to the dictators, the democracies repeatedly made concessions, desperately hoping that if they just gave the aggressors what they wanted, they'd eventually be satisfied. They basically watched as escalating conflicts went completely unchecked, hoping the crocodile would eat them last.
The sparks are really flying now, and the fuse is burning down to its final, frantic inches. This brings us to part 4, the point of no return.
Let's move through this timeline to see exactly how a localized fire becomes a global inferno. It began in 1918, with those deep, unresolved tensions from Versailles festering in the background. That resentment mutated into the 1930s, a decade defined entirely by unchecked aggression. It was a rapid-fire series of crises, moving faster and faster as the democracies continually backed down. And finally, we crash into 1939, and a strategic realignment that fundamentally sealed the fate of the world.
Unchecked aggression always escalates. Always. It's basically a fundamental law of history. The dictators pushed boundaries because they correctly realized no one was actually going to stop them. The ultimate symbol of this? The Munich Agreement. British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain literally flies to Germany, hands over a massive chunk of Czechoslovakia to Hitler, without the Czechs even being invited to the meeting, by the way, and returns home waving a piece of paper, declaring he had secured peace for our time. What a profound delusion. Just months later, Hitler completely broke the agreement and marched his army into the rest of Czechoslovakia. Appeasement had spectacularly failed.
And then came the shocker. The strategic realignment that truly terrified the globe. August 1939, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. Fascist Germany and the Communist Soviet Union were sworn ideological blood enemies. Yet, suddenly, they announced a non-aggression pact. But the real danger wasn't the public announcement, it was the secret protocol hidden inside. Behind closed doors, Hitler and Stalin had coldly agreed to slice Poland right down the middle for themselves. This monumental shift removed Hitler's ultimate nightmare, a two-front war. With the Soviet Union neutralized, the final barrier to a full-scale invasion was gone.
The stage was officially set. That fragile, broken peace that had miraculously limped along since 1918 was now completely shattered. By the final days of August 1939, massive armies were silently massing on the Polish border. The realization in London and Paris was cold and absolute. There were no more treaties to sign, no more land to give away, no more speeches to make. When the invasion of Poland commenced on September 1, 1939, it wasn't a surprise attack out of nowhere. It was the scheduled, inevitable arrival of a disaster the world had spent 2 decades passively permitting. The timer hit 0.
So, I want to leave you with this. How quickly can unchecked aggression and economic desperation rewrite the fate of the world? Just 21 years. From the devastating end of one global nightmare to the horrific beginning of an even worse one. And that's why understanding these historical ingredients, the unresolved tensions, the broken watchdogs, the absolute danger of desperate populations, and the deadly cost of appeasement is absolutely crucial for us today. Peace isn't just the absence of a gunshot. It's an incredibly fragile structure that has to be actively maintained. Because history shows us exactly what happens when we let the arsonists walk freely through the house, and that fuse finally runs out.
In the summer of 1941, the Third Reich was an absolute, unstoppable juggernaut. I mean, they had swallowed up entire nations in literally a matter of weeks, dominating this vast, terrifying expanse of Europe. But then, barely 4 years later, this supposedly invincible war machine completely imploded. A catastrophic, suicidal collapse that ended inside a cramped, claustrophobic, concrete box.
So it leaves us with one of history's wildest, most dramatic questions. How does an empire that stretched all the way from Spain to the Soviet border completely self-destruct in just a few short years? What exactly turned a military powerhouse, one that faced almost zero resistance early on, into an empire of fatal blunders, ending in the absolute ruins of Berlin? Well, let's dive into it.
Section 1. An unstoppable European empire. The peak of power.
To really grasp the sheer magnitude of this collapse, we first have to understand just how terrifyingly efficient this machine was right at the start. The speed of conquest, it was unlike anything the world had ever seen. Right, so in 1936, the Rhineland is absorbed. By 1938, Austria is annexed. They basically swallow up most of Czechoslovakia without firing a single shot. But then,
The real nightmare begins. Blitzkrieg, lightning war. In 1939, Poland is utterly crushed in just a matter of weeks using this revolutionary, highly mechanized style of warfare. But the true shocker to the global system hits in the spring of 1940. The German military just entirely bypasses the heavily fortified Maginot Line, making years and years of French defensive planning completely useless. We see the shockingly rapid collapse of Norway, Belgium, the Netherlands, and then, inexplicably, France falls in just 6 weeks. Add in the occupation of the Balkans, and you've got a footprint that is absolutely massive. From the outside, this war machine looks totally flawless. It seems perfectly designed, heavily armed, and completely unbeatable.
Section 2. Funding a broken machine. The economic illusion.
But if you actually peel back the curtain, the reality was completely different. The rest of the world saw this massive, unstoppable military machine, right? But the hidden reality was a fatally flawed, completely broke German economy. Seriously, how do you build and maintain the largest, most technologically advanced military on the continent when your national treasury is practically bankrupt? Well, the Third Reich relied on some incredibly heavy financial manipulation. They used these artificial promissory notes called MFO bills to secretly fund their rearmament, basically hiding a staggering, massive deficit from the global market. Think of it exactly like someone maxing out dozens of credit cards to fund a lavish millionaire lifestyle. The tanks are rolling, the planes are flying, for sure, but the financial foundation underneath the whole shebang is entirely rotten. They weren't generating wealth, they were bleeding cash. And this created an economic illusion that could only survive by constantly moving forward. The war machine literally had to keep conquering and looting the gold reserves and resources of neighboring nations just to pay the interest on its own massive debts. The second the expansion stopped, the whole economy was going to implode.
Section 3. Strategic disasters, the fatal blunders.
Now, when you have a financial foundation that fragile, you absolutely cannot afford to make mistakes. Now, this sprawling empire wasn't just brought down by the enemy. No, it was actively destroyed from within through massive, completely unforced strategic errors. And the pivot here is just wild. First, they abandoned their plans to invade Britain. So you decide to leave a highly capable, highly motivated enemy, Winston Churchill's Britain, sitting undefeated right off your western coast. And what do you do next? You completely pivot to launch Operation Barbarossa, a massive, full-scale invasion of the Soviet Union. Guys, this is the strategic equivalent of picking a street fight with a fresh heavyweight champion before you've even finished your current match in the ring. The geographical scale alone was a total nightmare. They pushed over 3 million Axis troops into a vast, unforgiving territory without adequate winter gear. They totally underestimated Soviet resolve and the incredibly brutal, lethal Russian winter. By doing this, they invited a grinding, massive two-front war. For an empire relying on maxed-out credit and rapid victories, getting bogged down into freezing, endless war of attrition in the East was sheer strategic absurdity. It was basically a death sentence.
Section 4. The problem with Italy. A useless alliance.
And look, when you're committing to a catastrophic two-front war, you desperately need strong, capable allies. But that is the exact opposite of what the Axis powers had. Italy was the ultimate liability in World War II. In any massive undertaking, terrible alliances become absolute dead weight. Having Italy as a primary partner during this conflict was exactly like being assigned a partner for a critical group project who not only does zero work, but actively ruins your final grade. Mussolini's ambitions vastly outpaced his actual military capabilities. So instead of securing the southern flank, Italy's forces required constant, massive military bailouts. Take Mussolini's disastrous, totally unprovoked invasion of Greece, or the fumbled military campaigns in North Africa. This was a fatal distraction. The German military had to entirely disrupt their own timelines, diverting desperately needed resources, elite troops, and crucial attention away from their primary objectives just to save their ally. And those bailouts? They delayed the invasion of the Soviet Union by several crucial weeks, essentially guaranteeing the German troops would be fighting straight into the dead of that lethal Russian winter.
Section 5. Cracks in the Inner Circle. The 1945 Endgame.
So, all of this, the completely broken economy, the wild strategic overreach in Russia, the devastating liability of terrible allies, it all leads straight to a dramatic, incredibly paranoid finish. We've gone from that sprawling, invincible empire of 1941 to a very dark, very claustrophobic reality in 1945. The total psychological collapse of the Inner Circle is staggering. As Soviet artillery literally hammered Berlin, the most fanatical loyalists finally cracked. You have Heinrich Himmler, the architect of so much terror, experiencing total shock and delusion. Realizing the end had arrived, he actually tried to secretly negotiate a surrender with the Western Allies right behind Hitler's back, genuinely believing he'd be allowed to lead a post-war Germany. I mean, no way.
Then you have Hermann Goering, who suddenly realizes the absolute reality of their total defeat. From a safe distance down south, he sends this frantic telegram asking to immediately take over total leadership of the Reich, which, as you can imagine, merely resulted in his immediate arrest for high treason by a furious, isolated Hitler. And ultimately, the whole thing culminates in Hitler's own suicide in that cramped underground Berlin bunker. When those maxed-out credit cards finally came due, the massive territorial gains were squandered and their delusions shattered. The entire machine just consumed itself from the very top.
Which leaves us with a final, really provocative thought. The supreme ego and unchecked overreach inevitably destroy every single empire. I mean, going from owning an entire continent to dying in a dark bunker, the fall of the Third Reich proves that an empire of blunders essentially guarantees its own destruction. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep asking those big questions, and I'll catch you next time as we dive into more incredible history.
You're standing in the middle of a massive, roaring crowd. Everyone around you is absolutely convinced that your empire is completely invincible, unstoppable, destined to rule the continent for 1,000 years. Every broadcast, every parade, every headline reinforces the idea that you are part of this perfect machine. But then, in less than a single decade, it all burns to ash, every last bit of it. So how does an empire go from intoxicating absolute power to devastating ruin so quickly? What does it actually look like when an empire that believes it's completely untouchable suddenly realizes, oh no, we are completely doomed? Well, in this explainer, we aren't just looking at old tactical maps. We're stepping directly into the minds of a losing nation at the absolute dizzying height of its power. We're going to watch that grand illusion completely shatter in real time. Because honestly, understanding how a society processes its own downfall tells us everything we need to know about the terrifying, seductive power of propaganda and the brutal reality check that always follows absolute hubris. All right, let's jump straight into Section 1, the grand illusion. So, before the world plunged into ruin, there was this incredibly vibrant facade. I want you to think of the early years of the Third Reich as a society completely intoxicated by its own promises. We usually picture this era in grainy black and white, right? But you've got to imagine it in pure, vivid color. Bright uniforms, these massive, perfectly synchronized military marches, sweeping speeches promising eternal glory. It wasn't just politics, it was a collective euphoria. They truly believed they were destined to dominate Europe. And honestly, for a minute there, their seemingly unstoppable advances made it look true. I mean, in 1940, entire nations were falling in a matter of weeks. The Blitzkrieg tactics shocked the entire globe, projecting this wild aura of mechanical invincibility. To the average citizen in those roaring crowds, the propaganda didn't feel like a lie. It felt like documented fact unfolding right before their eyes. They were on top of the world, and there was no way anything could bring them down. But there was a hidden reality operating right behind that propaganda machine. Think of it like a gleaming, massive skyscraper that's secretly being built on a completely crumbling foundation. The regime promised easy triumphs and endless glory, but the reality? Behind those most celebrated victories, the very first cracks of internal tension and initial wear were already showing. The war machine was hungry, like unbelievably hungry. It demanded resources, oil, steel, and manpower that the state just didn't inherently possess. So, to keep that illusion of a perfect society alive back home, they relied heavily on plundered resources from conquered territories. They were stretching their supply lines thinner and thinner. The home economy was secretly buckling under the intense pressure of trying to maintain a peacetime standard of living while fighting a multi-front war. The whole structure was incredibly fragile, just constantly teetering on the edge of overextension, even while the citizens were celebrating in the streets. Which brings us to Section 2, the Russian nightmare. This is where that unstoppable momentum violently hits a brick wall. Summer of 1941, the invasion of the Soviet Union kicks off, and hubris is absolutely peaking. Everyone expects another quick, glorious victory before the autumn leaves even fall. But then, the vast, unforgiving landscape and fiercely resilient opposition begin to drain the machine. Fast forward to the winter of 1942. That invincible, parade ground army, it's suddenly a mass of exhausted soldiers freezing on an incredibly hostile front, their supply lines completely snapped. And then comes early 1943. Complete failure at Stalingrad. Now, this wasn't just a lost battle. This was a massive, horrific meat grinder where hundreds of thousands of soldiers were swallowed by urban combat, starvation, and unimaginable cold. That aura of invincibility didn't just stall here, it shattered. It proved to the entire population back home that the era of easy triumphs was totally dead. The shockwave of losing an entire army sent a cold chill through a society that had never even been allowed to imagine the concept of retreating.
Moving on to Section 3. Trapped in total war.
So that massive military disaster dramatically shifted the focus from the freezing front lines right back to the crumbling home front. What did total war actually mean for the everyday people living through it? Well, it's a conflict where the illusion of victory completely dissolves into the absolute mobilization and ultimately the intense suffering of every single citizen. You see, early on, the regime really tried to shield the civilian populace. They kept theaters open and consumer goods flowing just to maintain this illusion of a master race untouched by consequence. But after Stalingrad, the mask was entirely ripped off. Total war meant total consumption. Women were pushed into factories, elderly men and young kids were drafted into defensive militias. Every single ounce of societal energy was violently redirected into merely surviving. It was no longer a story of conquest. It was a desperate, inescapable trap. The citizens were entirely locked into the terrifying consequences of their leaders' hubris.
You can actually watch the home front collapse in 3 brutal steps. Step 1, propaganda completely loses its power. I mean, you literally cannot successfully broadcast a message of national invincibility when the sky above your citizens is falling. The speeches just become hollow. Step 2, constant Allied bombings begin. This springs the devastating reality of the conflict directly to domestic soil. Day and night, massive industrial centers and historic cities are turned into raging infernos. The screaming sirens, the choking dust, it all becomes the daily reality for millions. The war wasn't on some map far away anymore. It was happening in their living rooms. And then, step 3, families frantically flee their ruined cities. It is a terrifying visual escalation. The orderly, synchronized society is violently replaced by millions of refugees, carrying whatever they can salvage on their backs, just wandering through the debris of a world they were told would last forever.
And this is the full-circle tragedy of the era. Remember how we started with the pure, vibrant color of that early euphoria and sweeping military marches? Well, as the war dragged on, that bright, intoxicating color faded entirely into the gray ash and rubble of destroyed cities. The vibrant facade had completely burned away. Those massive stadiums where they once held gigantic rallies were reduced to twisted metal and pulverized concrete. And this transition from pure color to gray ash, it wasn't just physical, it was deeply psychological. The entire worldview of a generation was systematically dismantled by the relentless, grinding reality of a war they had enthusiastically started, leaving absolutely nothing behind but the horrific consequences of their collective illusion.
Which leads us to our final section. Section 4. The final collapse.
The war finally reaches Berlin. 353. Those are the staggering final 353 days to defeat, counting down from the massive Allied pushes in mid-1944. Imagine the crushing weight and sheer scale of an entire empire's destruction compressed into less than a single year. It's just a relentless, terrifying squeeze. From the east, massive Soviet offensives are steamrolling toward the border. From the west and south, the Allies are pushing relentlessly onward. Every passing day brought enemy forces closer to the capital. Every single hour dismantled a piece of an empire that was promised to last a millennium. In these final days, the desperation was absolute. You literally had civilians fighting heavily armored tanks with bicycles and handheld explosives. The government was functionally disintegrating, communication lines were dead, and yet the gears of this doomed war machine were violently forced to keep turning right up until the very final moment of catastrophic failure.
Because the fall of Berlin was not just a military defeat, but a moral and social collapse. They didn't just lose territory, and they didn't just lose an army. They lost absolutely everything. It was the complete, devastating destruction of an entire society and the deeply toxic beliefs that had held it together. When the smoke finally cleared, the survivors weren't just looking at broken buildings. They were staring at the absolute bankruptcy of their ideology. The physical ruins of their cities perfectly mirrored their ruined society. Everything they had sacrificed for, everything they had been brainwashed to believe, was entirely erased. It is one of history's most stark examples of a complete societal reset, forced by catastrophic consequence. So, as we wrap up this explainer, we are left with a pretty haunting question. When the grandest illusions shatter, what is the ultimate cost to the society that believed them? It's a stark, terrifying reminder of the price of dangerous propaganda and the devastating fall that always follows absolute hubris. The journey from vibrant euphoria to total ash serves as a massive warning about the fragility of truth and the extreme danger of surrendering to an intoxicating narrative. Keep questioning the narratives around you, stay curious, and I'll catch you next time.